The next speaker, I'm sure every one of you knows as well, Xavier Manteca. He um, is from Barcelona, is a professor there. Now we see the other side. So we had a couple of neurologists speak about the brain. Now I hope to learn more from a behaviorist point of view. He's a great speaker. It's a really great pleasure to have him here. And I'm hopefully learning when normal becomes abnormal or vice versa, and how to find out about yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. Before I get started, I would like to thank Purina for inviting me to this conference. I am delighted to be here, so thank you very much for that. Also, I like to show my first slide, but right. So I like to thank my two colleagues, Dr. Susanna Lebrec and Dr. Marta Amat, for the help in putting together this presentation. Now, this is the plan of my talk. I like to start with a short introduction, dealing mainly with the animal welfare side of cognitive dysfunction syndrome. And then I will spend a significant amount of time looking at clinical aspects of cognitive dysfunction syndrome. And in particular, I like to look at why geriatric dogs may show changes in behavior caused by conditions other than cognitive dysfunction syndrome, and why we have to consider that before we reach a diagnosis of cognitive dysfunction syndrome. The third part of my talk is going to be on treatment and mainly on the scientific evidence for environmental enrichment and changes in husbandry, pharmacological intervention, and modification of diet. And then I will try to give a brief summary of the talk at the end of it. Okay, so let's get started with the introduction. Now, one of the reasons why we are here today is that dogs live longer now than ever before. And that is good because it shows that we are both willing and unable to provide good care for them. But as we all know, and not only from textbooks, also by personal experience, getting old comes with changes. And in dogs, those changes range from normal behavioral changes, which do not have an effect on welfare, probably, all the way down to medical conditions which will impair the welfare of the animal. So examples of this, well, geriatric dogs, senior dogs may be less active, less playful, spend more time resting than younger dogs, and that's fine. That doesn't have any effect on their welfare. But then, as examples of medical conditions which appear in geriatric dogs or which are more prevalent in geriatric dogs, we have cognitive dysfunction syndrome, and we have many other medical problems, in particular painful conditions which are more prevalent in senior dogs and which will have an effect on the animal's welfare. So clearly, one of the main topics of today is cognitive dysfunction syndrome, but I would like to start this talk by drawing your attention to the fact that there is much more to geriatric dogs than just cognitive dysfunction syndrome. And many of the other things that happen when dogs become old are very important, not only to reach a diagnosis of cognitive dysfunction syndrome, but also to set up a treatment plan for those dogs. Okay, so cognitive dysfunction syndrome. You are familiar with it. We have heard a definition given by Mette in the previous talk. So I'm not going to talk about it, but I would like to spend some time looking at cognitive dysfunction syndrome and animal welfare. That's the main topic in this introductory part of my talk. Now, when we scientists looking at animal welfare try to rank welfare problems from the most important ones down to the least important ones, when we try to rank them, one of the things we look at is how prevalent each problem is. And we have already heard that cognitive dysfunction syndrome may be highly prevalent. Interestingly enough, Mete has shown this very same study done by Spanish colleagues at the University of Zaragoza, and they found that in dogs older than 9 years, prevalence was higher than 20%. So 1 out of 5 dogs older than 9 years has cognitive dysfunction syndrome, so highly prevalent. So another thing we look at when we try to rank the importance of welfare problems is whether we are in a position to treat the problem quickly and well. And here we have an issue with cognitive dysfunction syndrome that has already been mentioned. And that issue is that very often we don't treat the problem simply because we miss it. So that prevalence of 20-something% in dogs older than 8 years is probably just the tip of the iceberg. Many owners give for granted the changes they see in senior dogs. And as Mette said, if we don't have a proactive attitude to identify dogs with these problems, we simply miss them. And if we miss them, we don't treat them. So a highly prevalent problem that is very often overlooked. So we may have a welfare issue here. So the question is, how and to what extent cognitive dysfunction syndrome impairs the welfare of dogs? And I like to suggest that cognitive dysfunction syndrome may have a negative effect on dogs' welfare through at least 3 different mechanisms. And one of them has to do with the emotions of the dog. Well, animal welfare has made a significant progress over the last few decades. And now we all agree that when we talk about animal welfare, we don't talk only about physical health. We talk about physical health, we talk about behavior, and we talk about emotions. And I would even suggest that most animal welfare scientists would agree that animal welfare is about emotions mainly. How well or how bad the animal feels. So you may be wondering now, fine, but what is the link between cognitive dysfunction syndrome and emotions? Well, the link is that in animals, many negative emotions are somehow related to stress or distress. And it has been shown, and we have an overwhelming evidence, that stress becomes worse when animals or humans are unable to predict what is going to happen. So lack of predictability increases the negative effects of stress. Now, if you think about it, then you will very easily realize the link with cognitive dysfunction syndrome. It is about predictability. And to predict what is going to happen next, what we use is the memory of past events. We say something like, I know that this is going to happen now because last week, when I was in this very same situation, this or that happened. And the only way we can do that is because we remember things. And if we lose memory, that ability to remember the past and therefore predict the future based on past experiences is lost. And that is what we think may be happening to animals with cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Now, there is another very interesting mechanism for a behaviorist in terms of animal welfare, and that is cognitive bias. Well, I will explain later, and Mette has said that very often dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome suffer anxiety, including separation anxiety and other forms of anxiety as well. And we know that dogs with separation anxiety have what we call a negative cognitive bias. Well, what is cognitive bias? Cognitive bias means that our cognitive processes will be affected by how we feel. If we feel happy, our cognition is different from our cognition when we feel unhappy. And there are mainly three types of cognitive bias in humans. Judgment bias, memory bias, and attention bias. And out of these three, the one that has been most studied in animals has been judgment bias. Judgment bias is the half full, half empty glass story. And it basically means that if you are happy when something which is neither good nor bad happens to you, you will judge that as being good. If you are sad when something happens to you which is neither good but happens to you, you will judge that as being bad. Well, thanks to work done by British colleagues at Bristol University, now we are able to study judgment bias in animals. We have looked at, behaviorists and animal welfareists have looked at cognitive bias in dogs with separation anxiety, and we have found that separation anxiety has a very profound effect on cognitive bias. And to make a long story short, dogs with anxiety are pessimistic. So they judge neutral events as being negative. Well, if cognitive dysfunction syndrome increases the prevalence of separation anxiety, and that leads to a cognitive bias, then we have a welfare issue here. I do a little bit of work, actually most of my work is with farm animals, and when I give a talk on dogs to a dog and cat audience, and there are some colleagues of mine in the audience, they are always afraid that I will somehow end up telling a cattle story. And they are right, because I tend to do that. So I will tell you a very short cattle story, which is, I hope, relevant to the context of this talk. You all know that some cows come with horns. And you know as well that it is a common practice to dehorn cows. And you may know that very often that is done without analgesia and anesthesia, which is extremely painful, as you may imagine. Well, surprise, surprise, when we do that without analgesia and anesthesia to a cow, the cow goes through a period of profound negative cognitive bias caused by pain. The interesting point here is that the extent of that cognitive bias caused by such a brutal husbandry practice is not significantly different to the extent of cognitive bias suffered by dogs with separation anxiety, with yet one big difference. Once pain is over in cows, cognitive bias is over. And yet, dogs with separation anxiety, unless they are treated, will remain with separation anxiety and a profound negative cognitive bias. And that may well apply to many dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome. And yet we have a third mechanism whereby cognitive dysfunction syndrome may impair the welfare of the animals. Now, you know that dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome suffer from poor quality sleep, less sleep, so on, changes in the sleep pattern. Well, this slide tries to explain very simply the links between stress, pain, and sleep. And for many years, we have known that stress has a negative effect on the quality of sleep. So that's well known. What we know now is that reduced sleep increases sensitivity to pain, and that causes stress. So now just imagine a geriatric dog with, say, osteoarthritis and cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Cognitive dysfunction syndrome will lead to reduced quality of sleep. Osteoarthritis will lead to chronic pain. And both things will interact and lead to a positive feedback that will end up with clearly poor welfare. Okay. So far, so good. Remember two main ideas until now. There is more than cognitive dysfunction syndrome when we talk about geriatric dogs, and we have to consider that. And every time you face a dog with cognitive dysfunction syndrome, what you have in front of you is very likely an animal which may suffer poor quality of life due to the three mechanisms I just explained, and probably many others as well. Okay, so second part of my talk is about diagnosis of cognitive dysfunction syndrome, and more in general, behavioral changes in senior dogs. You are familiar with this, Mette has shown that, and you have this information in your proceedings, at the end of the proceedings, not as part of my talk, but as part of Gary's talk. So I'm not going to get into the details of that, which is likely to be very well known. But I would like to emphasize two ideas using this slide here. So first idea, when we look at these 6 or 7, if you wish, if we add here learning deficits, when we look at these 6 or 7 domains, we have a list of signs, of symptoms. And what I would like you to remember is that some of these signs are very straightforward. For example, house oiling. That's very straightforward. But some other signs are not straightforward at all, because they may be shown in rather different, even opposite ways, depending on each individual dog with cognitive dysfunction syndrome. For example, we may have dogs which, when we look at this domain here, interaction, we tend to think, well, dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome will show less social activity, fewer social interactions, and that does happen. But some other dogs may show a completely different story and become more irritable, which owners may label as showing some sort of aggression. So under interaction, we may have two very different signs. Look at activity. Traditionally, we will think of dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome as being less active, and that happens very often. But then we have dogs which may walk aimlessly or may show repetitive behaviors, which may give the impression that they are more active than normal. So not all signs are that straightforward, and they can be really diverse. So that's the first idea. And the second idea is that, and that is key to make a diagnosis, the second idea is that if you think about it, all of these clinical signs may be caused by conditions other than cognitive dysfunction syndrome. So remember, when you have a dog with maybe cognitive dysfunction syndrome, what you have is a senior dog. And the behavior of a senior dog is going to be different regardless of whether the dog has CDS or not. So what is the cause of those behavioral changes in senior dogs caused by conditions other than cognitive dysfunction syndrome? Well, we have several possibilities here. One possibility is that the dog has always had, or for a long time, a problem, and that problem has become worse due to the aging process, and that oftentimes is due to diseases or medical conditions in general. So first possibility, the dog has had for a long time a problem, and aging has made that problem worse. A second possibility is that the dog is fine behavior-wise until it becomes a geriatric individual, and then either because of medical problems or either because of environmental causes or non-medical ones, a behavioral problem appears. So let me give you 4 examples of these 2 scenarios here. So remember, we have dogs which are fine until they get old, and then either because of disease or environmental changes they develop a behavioral change, or we have dogs with already had a behavioral change that becomes worse due to medical problems. 4 examples which I believe may be the most common ones. First one has been mentioned by Mette. Problems with sight or hearing. More prevalent, clearly, in geriatric dogs, and we know that rather significant percentage of dogs with sensorial impairments may display changes in behavior. So in this study, for example, more than 20% of dogs with vision loss will have an increase in dependence from the owners that may be taken as, for example, separation anxiety or anyway a significant change in behavior. So first example, which I think is really important in a practical setting. So second example, well, pain. And my colleague Thomas Kams here in the audience has published about the link between pain, mainly caused by osteoarthritis, and aggressive behavior in dogs. So what is the chain of events here? Well, we know that as dogs become older, the prevalence of painful conditions increases. Among them, osteoarthritis is of paramount importance. And osteoarthritis will very likely modify the behavior of the dog. And one of the possible changes in behavior caused by osteoarthritis may be an increase in aggressive behavior. Now, the reason for that is complex. The most obvious explanation is that the dog may become aggression when it feels pain simply because it wants to avoid further pain upon being touched, for example. But then we have some more complex, sophisticated mechanisms. And we know that chronic pain will have 2 effects. One is a obviously decrease in physical activity, and the other one is chronic stress. And we also have that both a decrease in physical activity and chronic stress may lead to a reduction in serotonin activity in the brain. Now, the link between serotonin activity and aggression is far less clear than we thought a few years ago. I mean, you may still come across texts that say high serotonin means low aggression, low serotonin means high aggression. Well, that's not true. But we do have good data, mainly monkey data and rat data, showing that when there is a significant reduction in serotonin activity, we do see an increase in out-of-context aggression and in aggression without warning signals. So there is a link between reduced serotonin activity and some forms of aggression, mainly those which are probably most problematic. And we know that some medical conditions causing chronic pain, which are highly prevalent in senior dogs, will cause that reduction in serotonin activity. Third example, and an easy one, really. One of the main signs in cognitive dysfunction syndrome is house oiling. But clearly enough, geriatric dogs may show or may suffer from house oiling due to many other causes other than cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Pain, once again, metabolic and other conditions that cause these changes here, and lack of control in micturition or defecation. So once again, house oiling in a geriatric dog does not equal to cognitive dysfunction syndrome. And my last example of this overview of behavioral changes in geriatric dogs. Separation anxiety. We have two sets of data here looking at behavioral problems in geriatric dogs. And according to this study here, cognitive dysfunction ranks number 5, separation anxiety ranks number 1. In this second set of data, cognitive dysfunction ranks number 2, separation anxiety ranks number 3. So the two ideas we may get from this are, one, separation anxiety is very common in geriatric dogs, and two, it might be some comorbidity between cognitive dysfunction syndrome and separation anxiety. You all know about separation anxiety. You know that a dog with separation anxiety will show a variety of behavioral changes when left alone, when the dog is not with its owner. The most prevalent behavioral change in separation anxiety is increased vocalization. But then we have many other problems, and most of them can be mistaken by cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Now, the problem with separation anxiety is that even if cognitive dysfunction syndrome increases the risk of separation anxiety may be caused by many other mechanisms. And the mechanisms underlying separation anxiety are so complex that we are still discussing them. I mean, traditionally, most behaviorists would have said, well, separation anxiety is about hyperattachment. Hyperattachment between dog and owner. Then we discovered that not all dogs with hyperattachment have separation anxiety and vice versa. And it was suggested that in some cases, separation anxiety is not related to attachment, is caused by conditioned fear. And more recently, and thanks to a crosstalk with our human medical colleagues, we are suggesting that there is more to attachment than just hyperattachment, and some dogs with separation anxiety develop the problem not because they have hyperattachment, but because they have unstable, inappropriate attachment. So to make a long story short, the idea is geriatric dogs may develop separation anxiety because they have cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Yes, but they may develop separation anxiety because of many other causes. So separation anxiety in a geriatric dog does not equal to cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Okay, and yet there is another twist to this complexity of behavioral changes in geriatric dogs. Now, when we talk about behavior of dogs, well, we think about a dog doing things, and that's fine, good or bad. But we shouldn't forget something which is obvious. It is not the dog who decides to go to the vet. It is the owner. So what brings that action is not just the severity of the behavioral change, but more precisely how that behavioral change is perceived by the owner. And now you may be thinking, well, yes, that's very clear, but what has it to do with aging in dogs? Well, one thing about aging is that aging is about time going by. Now, obviously. Now, imagine a dog which has a behavioral problem. It's a young dog, and it has a behavioral problem. But it's not that bad. So the owner says, okay, I live with it now. So time goes by, the dog becomes old, the behavior stays the same, but the owner gets fed up. And so the behavior doesn't change, but the reaction of the owner to that behavior becomes more pronounced. So living with a problem for 1 year is bad. Living with it for 5, 6, 7 years may be just too bad. So if the owner reaction goes up and goes beyond his or her tolerance, then what was perceived as a non-significant problem may become a problem severe enough to seek advice. So when there is a behavioral change in an animal, think about two possibilities. The behavior of the animal has changed, really, or the way that behavior is perceived by the owner has changed. And that may happen simply because of time exhausting the owner, or in some cases because life has become more complicated due to family or other issues. So there are many factors playing in this game, and the owner and how he or she reacts to the behavior of the dog is something we have to consider very, very carefully indeed. Okay. So we have looked at welfare issues of cognitive dysfunction syndrome. We have looked at the clinical aspects and how the behavior of geriatric dogs changes regardless of cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Let's talk a little bit about treatment, and not in detail, because many of the things, particularly related to changes in diet, will be dealt with by Gary. But I would like to start going back to fundamental science and looking at one key finding in aging process and cognitive dysfunction syndrome, and that is neuron loss. And I am going back to this, to basic physiology, if you want, because I think it is fundamentally important to understand why changes in husbandry and changes in routine and changes in the environment are so important when addressing cognitive dysfunction syndrome. So I am not saying, far from it, that drugs are not useful. They are useful, and clearly changes in diet can be extremely useful. What I am saying is that we have to put things into perspective and look at husbandry and the environment of the dog as well. And that is more than just a well-meant advice. It's something which is well-grounded in science, and neuron loss is a significant part of that story. So what is the thing with neuron loss? Well, we know that when dogs age, particularly when they don't age in a healthy manner, when they develop cognitive dysfunction syndrome, there is a significant loss in neuron numbers in different brain areas, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. And we also know that this is to a significant extent due to a reduction in replacement of lost neurons by the process of creating new neurons, so neurogenesis. And finally, we know that there is a good correlation between reduced neurogenesis and cognitive deficits in dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome. So neuron loss is important, it explains symptoms, and it is mainly caused by a reduction in neurogenesis. So what is the link with the environment, husbandry of the dog? Well, we know that this process of producing new neurons, the process of neurogenesis, has been particularly well studied in the hippocampus of many animals. And again, this is a very rather simplistic slide, but the key message here is that there are several things that have a negative effect on neurogenesis. And among those things that reduce neurogenesis, there are two which are particularly important in the context of this talk: age, clearly enough, and chronic stress. We know that the effects of aging on neurogenesis are compounded by the effects of chronic stress. So getting old is bad. Getting old and having a stressful life is very bad indeed. And that applies not only to dogs, it applies to many other species, including primates. But the good news about it is that there are some things that may slow down this process because they have a positive effect on neurogenesis. And among those things that increase neurogenesis, we have physical activity, physical exercise, and environmental enrichment. And it's basically because of the ideas summarized in this slide that changes in husbandry and in the environment are so fundamentally important to improve the quality of life of geriatric dogs, with or without cognitive dysfunction syndrome. And what is the idea? Well, the idea is that, and that's good, these two helps, physical activity and enrichment, may interact in a positive manner, may have additive effects. Now, this is a very nice paper looking at the effects of physical activity in mice. And basically, what it was found is that in a wild type of mice, those individuals that were given the opportunity to run on a wheel had a higher density of neurons as compared with control individuals that didn't have the opportunity to run on a wheel. The interesting thing is that this finding was replicated in a different strain of mice which has been bred for a reduced neurogenesis. So if you take that strain as a model of reduced neurogenesis in old age, the take-home message is that physical activity is good for our brains, even when something is slowing down neurogenesis, for example, old age. Now, the second idea comes from this other paper here, and they look at the interaction between our two friends, physical activity and an enriched environment. And basically what we have here is control individuals. This is in mice again, control individuals, individuals with an enriched environment, individuals which have the opportunity to do physical exercise, and individuals that live in an enriched environment and do physical exercise. And what they look at is number of new neurons. And as you can see, living in a rich environment is good. Doing physical exercise is good. Doing physical exercise in a rich environment is much better. And the reason for this additive effect is that apparently both mechanisms, rich environment and physical exercise, act upon different underlying mechanisms. One has a survival promoting effect, survival of new neurons, that's enriched environment, whereas physical exercise, what does is have a pro-neurogenic effect. So basically, to make a long story short, with physical exercise, we stimulate the production of new neurons. Living in a rich environment, we reduce the mortality of those new neurons. So how does all this translate into practice? Well, basically, when we talk about changes in environment and husbandry in geriatric dogs and dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome, what we suggest is doing three things: providing a dog-friendly environment, and once again, remember, dog-friendly not only thinking about cognitive deficits, thinking about other deficits which are very likely in geriatric dogs, retraining the dog and enriching the environment. So what does it mean? Well, simple things which in real life are the ones which are more likely to be done and the ones which are more likely to have a significant effect. Not everything is about cognition, chronic pain, lack in mobility, so on. So make life easier for the dog. Think that the dog, so make life easier for the dog. Think that the dog is going to spend a higher amount of time resting, sleeping, so provide comfort for the dog. And when it comes to enriching the environment, three main ideas. Environmental enrichment for dogs means 1, providing opportunity for play and exploration. 2, physical exercise, of course, tailored to the needs of geriatric dogs, and we can go the easy, cheap way or do things in a more sophisticated manner. This vet hospital in Madrid, is it? And yes, clearly in Spain, it's in Madrid that provides this sort of physical exercise for geriatric dog. And then don't forget that the most important form of environmental enrichment for dogs is social interaction. And here some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, that's the behaviorist, animal welfare person, saying nice things, affiliative behavior, touching the dog, and so on. What's the science behind it? Well, I don't have time to get into the details, but we know that 2 things. When dogs are able to show affiliative behaviors with owners, changes in the brain of the dog and the owner happen, including an increase in the release of oxytocin. And oxytocin inhibits chronic stress, so that's good. Remember, stress reduces neurogenesis. And we also know that when given the opportunity with operant conditioning tasks, given the opportunity to choose between different resources, including food, domestic dogs put human company as number 1 resources. So from a dog perspective, this is the main form of environmental enrichment. So clearly, this is my behaviorist bias, looking at environmental enrichment, affiliative behavior, physical exercise, and so on. We shouldn't forget, of course, about many other things we can do with geriatric dogs and dogs with cognitive dysfunction syndrome, using drugs. And I'm going to be extremely brief about it because you know, I'm sure about it. We have 3 main drugs which have been shown to have an effect on cognitive dysfunction syndrome. Probably the one for which we have the most evidence is selegiline, which increases dopamine activity and has a range of other effects as well. This is the one for which we, I say, have most evidence, but then we have propentophilin that also has been shown to have a positive effect, mainly because it reduces inflammation in the brain. And finally, we have nisergolin, which mainly acts on blood flow to the brain and also has some other effects. Now, just about to finish, 3 minutes left. So the last chunk of, but not least chunk of treatment strategies is changes in diet. So I'm going to be brief with this because I know that Gary is going to deal with that in detail, and he is far more entitled than I am to talk about this. But I'd like to give you 2 main ideas. When we change the diet to enhance the quality of life for a geriatric dog, we have 5, or we may have 5 main aims in our mind. So there are many things we can do through changes in diet for the brain of geriatric dogs. We may provide alternative energy sources to the aging brain that has difficulties in using glucose. We may have an antioxidant effect. we may improve blood flow to the brain, we may reduce inflammation, and finally, we may increase synaptic plasticity. So we may target, through changes in diet, many, if not most, of the changes that happen in the brain of senior dogs. And for each of these targets, we do have strong scientific evidence. Just an example of that, antioxidant diet, looking at learning abilities through this particular test, which is called the oddity test. The only thing which is relevant here is that it measures learning ability. And you have 4 groups of dogs, young given a controlled diet, young with an antioxidant diet. So we are looking at errors. So the lower the bar, the better the learning ability. So young dogs, regardless of diet, do very well. The difference comes when we look at all dogs. We have all dogs with controlled diet and all dogs with antioxidant diet. And as you can see, there is significant, very dramatic effect of this antioxidant diet when given to all dogs in terms of cognitive abilities. So we do have evidence for some other mechanisms as well, including MCT, and I know that Gary will dealing with that in detail. So that brings me to the end of my talk, basically, with a summary in which I would like to highlight three ideas. And the 3 ideas have like a common thought for all of them. It's that when you face a geriatric dog which may have cognitive dysfunction syndrome, take a broad perspective. And take a broad perspective in 3 different manners. First, think that those changes you see may be caused by cognitive dysfunction syndrome, yes, but they may be a consequence of many other medical or behavioral conditions. Second thing is that when you design the treatment strategy, do not think only about cognitive deficits. Remember, you have a senior dog which very likely may suffer chronic pain and reduce mobility. So take all that into account. Even if the dog does have cognitive dysfunction syndrome, it may have as well other things. So consider all that when designing your treatment. And finally, and most important, remember the key thing is not treating cognitive dysfunction syndrome or whatever the condition is. The key thing is taking care of the welfare of the animal. And cognitive dysfunction syndrome and many other conditions which are more prevalent in senior dogs do have or may have a significant effect on the welfare of the animal. So think about that when designing both your treatment and the limits to that treatment. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Purina once again for the invite.